Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors, welcome to the first presentation in the Sand Creek Massacre Foundation Speaker Series. My name is Alexa Roberts. I am the interim board chair, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this evening's program. We'll begin this evening with a land acknowledgement statement. In what is Eads, Colorado today, we gather on the traditional and treaty lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, Osage, and other indigenous nations who also retain traditional and historic ties to the lands on which we meet. We acknowledge the lasting impacts of the Sand Creek Massacre on the Cheyenne and Arapaho people and their inseparable traditional, historical, and spiritual connections of the indigenous nations native to this land, and honor their strength, cultural vibrancy, and communities today. The Sand Creek Massacre Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the educational initiatives of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. One of our primary goals is to assist the historic site. One of our primary goals is to assist the National Historic Site in establishing the Center for Sand Creek Massacre Studies. Through these educational efforts, we hope to promote understanding of the relevance of the Sand Creek Massacre to our contemporary world. Now I'm honored to introduce Mr. Conrad Fisher, a member of our Board of Directors and a member of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, who will begin our program with a prayer. Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I appreciate that. It's quite an honor to be able to be part of this discussion group and be one of the presenters of such an important issue in Indian country and of a very important historic site. And it gives me, makes me happy to be able to be chosen to say a prayer for tonight's event. So with that, I'm going to say a prayer in my own language, the Northern Cheyenne language. And I'd like also everybody to pray in their own language. It's such an important event in the history of Native Americans and in the significance and what happened there, that when we all pray together, we can accomplish a lot. So with that, I'll say a prayer in my language. Maya does tua zihu weto hua does hua to women near Mr. Women and Maya hua does it the duckstan and hua to the sort in here Sand Creek to kiss door hua the wunanis to hot mages Maya. That's the metan at toss. No stanum. That's dump done in here to oh, na, just this metan at toss without hope. Now, this tomato, they hope, National Park Service, the kistons. This boo at home. Ta one done it to you and here. Scared to a niche. Sakeho, hot to one there. My that's it. It's a give horn. Scared met done it to one there. Hör det så baches. Hör det ne hårtes. Na det så unannes. Ma hör das in der Gehen nicht schon das. Hör det bude det kommune. Hör hat das hör det matze. Hör hör det beve med. Hör henne det mannes. Hör das må beve ta ma das det man ännu. Man så där behöver ännu något. Netta hör vi hör komma stanna han das da nicht schon. Das är da med den då ne hör det har mutas. Hör så på mutas man na hos hostan. Na hör ta hosto mat da det har med det så det med oss det som är det var med wonannis. Hör mal hör. Så det med den då ne. Again ni schon det. Det behöver tanumma här det behöver det textan hör se det hem hur det är na det där ni ska västa mest mig det och sätta tanumma det behöver tanumma mig hör det ska ma ta det ska det måste behöver så vad ge ich tanumma här det nee, nicht überstehen haben wir nicht mehr. Da nicht man muss selbst mehr. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce Miss Elleni Sclavenitis, award-winning filmmaker, who will introduce her film, Only the Earth and Mountains.
Thank you, Alexa, and thank you for having me. I want to thank the foundation. I grew up in Denver, and I never learned about the Sand Creek Massacre in school, or when I was growing up here. I went to college here as well. It wasn't until a few years ago that I finally learned about the Sand Creek Massacre. It's a defining moment in Colorado state history and in US history, and I think it's a history we should all know about. So for me, making this film was my way of learning about that history. The title of the film, Only the Earth and the Mountains, is from the song that Chief White Antelope, an Arapaho chief, sang as the troops stormed the encampment at Sand Creek on the morning, cold November morning of 1864. We want to invite you to stay through to the end of the credits, because afterwards there will be a discussion with descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre. So please stay through the end of the credits for the discussion. Just so you know, you can adjust the audio on your end, but the film itself will be streamed through our platform. So you can adjust the audio, but the film will just play straight through. And also we invite you to join in the conversation, so you can share your questions and comments in the chat, and we will try to answer them after the screening. You can also send us questions during the discussion, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I think the discussion will be very interesting and hope you all stay. Thank you.
We had a lot of land. And then the miners came through and the railroads came through.
This is the place where they were supposed to get rid of us completely. That was their objective. This is the place that we were supposed to be taken off this earth. They tried.
Back on November 29th, 1864, at 9 a.m. in the morning, Colonel Chivington attacked a peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people.
Can you just imagine everything that went on that morning? Some of the women thought the buffalo were coming, but instead it was the troops. The horses' hooves.
Now it's my great honor to introduce our panelists. Mr. Conrad Fisher is a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe who grew up in the little village of Burney on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, a traditional cultural community. He served as Dean of Cultural Affairs at Chief Knife College for 5 years before entering graduate school at the University of Montana studying Cultural Resources Management. He served as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for 10 years and is currently serving as a member of the State of Montana Burial Board. Welcome, Mr. Fisher. Dr. Henrietta Mann is a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes and was the founding president of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Tribal College in Weatherford, Oklahoma. She is Professor Emerita at Montana State University, where she also occupied the endowed chair in Native American Studies and was special assistant to the president. She gained tenure at the University of Montana, where she taught Native American Studies for nearly 28 years. She has also taught at the University of California, Berkeley, Harvard University, and Haskell Indian Nations University. In 1991, Rolling Stone magazine named Dr. Mann as one of the 10 leading professors in the nation. She earned Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Indian Education Association and the College Board Native American Student Advocacy Institute. She is also one of 2 Native American scholars ever elected to the National Academy of Education and was also recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Mann holds an honorary doctorate in human letters from Smith College in Massachusetts. In addition to her educational accomplishments, Dr. Mann served as the director of the Office of Indian Education Programs for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and was the national coordinator of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act Coalition for the Association on American Indian Affairs. In 2017, she received a Spirit Aligned Legacy Award as a carrier of Indigenous community values, memory, and wisdom. Welcome, Dr. Mann. Mr. Ryan Ortiz is an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and an official representative to the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site as sanctioned by tribal resolution. As a direct descendant of Chief White Antelope, he has had the honor of working on the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site project for the Northern Arapaho tribe for the past 7 years. Additionally, he is the CEO of Arapaho First, the Northern Arapaho tribe's holding company for all of their for-profit businesses. Ryan holds a Master's of Business Administration in Accounting and was the first non-governmental employee to obtain the Certified Indian Fiduciary Trust Specialist Certificate through the Department of Interior. The Sand Creek Massacre project is not just a part of a job for him. It is part of his life and is one of his highest priorities. It is a personal effort of his to bridge the generational disconnect that has been created due to displacement from the Sand Creek Massacre. Mr. Ortiz always reminds everyone when he talks to them that if our children forget about the Sand Creek Massacre, then those soldiers will have succeeded in what they set out to do on November 29th, 1864. Welcome, Mr. Ortiz. Ms. Elleni Sclavenitis is an artist and filmmaker based in Denver, Colorado. Her work considers the world through the lens of history and explores repressed historical events in order to expose the power structures underlying conceptions of historical truth. Through all of her projects, she aims to show how the past reverberates through the present in significant and often unacknowledged ways. She has shown her work at international venues, including Germany and Vienna, Austria, and nationally at the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles, Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach, California, the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., the Tallgrass Film Festival in Wichita, Kansas, the Pocahontas Reframed Film Festival at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the Santa Fe Film Festival, among others. She has worked as a film editor in Los Angeles and taught in the art department at Otis College of Design. She received her Master's of Fine Arts from the California Institute of the Arts. Welcome, Ms. Sclavenitis, and thank you to all our panelists for joining us here this evening.
Thank you.
As people are submitting questions from the audience, we'll just start with a question that we've already had, and ask the panelists how being a descendant of the Sand Creek Massacre has shaped and impacted your individual lives. Let's start with Dr. Mann.
Good evening to everyone, and I want to thank Elleni for the film. I also want to thank Mr. Fisher for his prayer that began this gathering. And thank you, Alexa, for your good work with the Sand Creek Foundation. And I want to thank Mr. Ortiz for all that he has done for our ancestors and continues to do. What we need to recognize as descendants of Sand Creek is in talking about DNA. Well, we did not have DNA in 1864 or even prior to 1492. But what we had was the bloodline that flows through our veins. The same blood that flows through my veins flowed through the veins of my great-grandmother, White Buffalo Woman, Lois Stock, who was a survivor of Sand Creek, and 4 years later, a survivor of the Washita battle along the Lodgepole River in Oklahoma Territory. These events have shaped my view of the world. We, as an educated people of this country, are always talking about knowing our history, United States history, the history of the American West. But we too, as this land's first peoples, too have our history. Unfortunately, it appears very seldom in the pages of the books that are taught and used in the schools of this nation. But what they have to understand is that this country has a history that few people care to acknowledge, and that is the unfortunate massacre of not just the Cheyenne and Arapahoes at these two events, but as Mr. Ortiz said, of all of the indigenous nations, First Nations across this continent. Those that came to live with us saw that we were wealthy in the land that gives us love, land that provides us with an identity. So these events that have happened not just to us, but to our relatives in this land need to be understood by mainstream America, because we are a part of the United States history. In fact, we were the first peoples whose pages of history should be noted in those books used in the public schools of this nation. The Sand Creek Massacre has impacted my entire life, and I was so fortunate to have spent some 4 years with my great-grandmother. I'm sure she taught me not just in holding me in her arms, but for the blood that she has that runs through my veins. I will never, ever forget the unfortunate tragedy of my beloved ancestors. And as citizens of this United States of America, we need to understand that we have not always been as good relations as we can be, but that we are all related to as the different colored peoples of this land who now share this land that was once only ours. You never forget that history, not at Sand Creek or of all the other events in terms of are being victims of genocide and extermination and all that we have experienced. The beauty is that we are still alive and we will continue to live because we are connected to this wonderful sacred earth.
Thank you, Dr. Mann, for sharing your personal experiences. I'd like to ask Mr. Ortiz the same question. How has being a descendant shaped and impacted your life?
Well, thank you. Happy to be a part of this tonight. You know, the Sand Creek Massacre is such a horrific event, you know, and I always say it displaced our people. You know, we're not where we should be, and you know, it sent us north and south from where we should be, amongst people in Colorado, you know, living our lives there, growing up in those communities and in that culture. So it impacts us greatly, you know, in today's world. That's the Sand Creek Massacre and everything that happened in that time is the beginning of historical trauma. Was mentioned in the film briefly, but historical trauma started at that time for us, for our people. So a lot of people deal with that historical trauma and don't even know that it started from that time frame and the massacre. They don't even know what historical trauma is at this point in their lives. So it impacts not only me, but it impacts our people today. When I think back about that day as a father, I think about young children being used as target practice, you know, by so-called men, you know, protecting or taking care of what they think is right, but so disgustingly massacring and mutilating our people. And then as time goes on, you know, it gets generationally further along in time, and you get people, our own people, say, oh, just let it go, you know. But how can you let that go when you think about 6-year-old or 7-year-old boy and girl being shot at, you know, used as target practice? And these are from letters wrote days after, you know, by Silas Sewell that told of these horrific events. They you know, I remember in his letter he talks about this woman and her children sitting there begging for their lives, begging for mercy while these men come in and shoot at them. And the mother, the only thing she can do that's humane is she slit her kids' throats before she did the same to herself. You know, that's what they did that day. And that's why I work on this project, because that it impacts us greatly. So, you know, thank you for allowing me to be here and having the pleasure to work on this project. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And Mr. Fisher, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, and first of all, I share the same sentiments with Dr. Mann and Ryan. Thank you for putting this on. I think it's a great venue to share the history of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Northern Arapaho, and the Northern Cheyenne people. It opens, I think, a broader mindset and a perspective about some of the events in Indian country, the atrocities, the dark side, if you will, of American history. I think Dr. Mann has really put it eloquently in terms of what manifest destiny meant during those times. But in response to your question, I think we need to understand before we actually talk about Sand Creek and the implications, how has that affected me personally? I think we have to look at some of the things that were discussed, including what Ryan had to say about collective trauma. Of course, we all know what collective trauma means, and that is those things that have affected us traumatically, whether it's an atrocity such as Sand Creek or some other trauma. Those things have been evident and present throughout the history of colonialism. And certainly it has permeated the reservation days as well, and to the present. So we have to look at it in that sense. Think about the structural spheres that are in place from the inception of reservations. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, subsidies that go onto reservations, puts us in a place where we're limited in and confined as well when we talk about services to Indian nations. Those structural spheres that are supposed to help us in many cases, in most cases, are the same structures that hurt us. If we go back to even to our childhood experiences, those adverse effects, and I'm talking about Native American communities, and that could also include non-Indian communities, those that are low on the social economic ladder. But for Native Americans, I think there was an extra layer of those restrictions. For example, if we have to have an enrollment card, we have to show our IDs to receive certain services. So, and all the other things that have gone on. I can name one, the boarding schools, and some of the things that were going on there. These are also tragedies that happen. These are traumatic experiences that we've had, even just to go off the reservation. There's certain, we could name a lot of people, most of the people on the reservation that have experienced trauma over and over again because of these entities that are trying to help us, but more in a sense hurt us. So trauma has been with us for a long time, and oftentimes in dire situations. Some people have trauma that has led to death, and so and other ailments, social pathologies. So when you talk about those types of chronic extreme stressors, that can affect the next generation and so on to the next generation. So it's intergenerational trauma, collective trauma for tribes. And so that, whether it's been passed through also passed through in our DNA, these types of traumas to the next kin. And I think that ties to Dr. Mann's experience of feeling those ancestors like it was yesterday because of the circular mentality of Native Americans. Dr. Little Bear talked about linear thinking, and that's true. It's the sins of the past of the larger society that makes them guilty. That conscience, the conscience that serves as a moral guide to a lot of the things that happen. So when we visit a site, we already have these traumas, and that's certainly true for me. I can relate to that, having traumas, having gone to boarding school, having issues back home, dysfunction, all those things. You have that trauma with you. So when you go to a place like this, to the actual site of the massacre, that just brings all this back into focus, back into that circle. So you've never really left that place. And it becomes evident once you get there because of the stories that are shared. In the movie, when Miss Spotted Out was talking, you could feel, you could sense, that the trauma, maybe she hadn't been there, but the stories that she heard brings back all those emotions like they were yesterday. So I bring that up because that's the type of impact it had on me. Growing up in a traditional community, where there was gravel roads, there was no phones, and we'd never been to the site. We've heard of the Sand Creek Massacre. It was a foreign concept. We heard these things, but where was it? As you grow older and you grow up and you begin to see a larger worldview, then you begin to know these things. But the psychological trauma is present already. And so when you get to that place, it has a tremendous effect. I don't think I have words that can describe the feeling at that place. I think all I can say is that we need to be there to have those experiences. And oftentimes the experience you have there is an experience that only you know about. You can't put it into words. There's that spiritual connection, there's that emotional connection, there's that physical connection. All those things come together at that time. So those are the type of feelings that I have, many different emotions that come to mind. But as a man, as a male, sometimes you have to confine those emotions. You have to be strong for either your children, your parents, those that look upon you as being a leader. You have to be there for those people. And I see that the thing that I see, and so that's my answer to your question. But the thing that I want to share as well is the indifference that we see in the past. And indifference is a powerful tool. And we see that in the history of our nation, in the vanishing race, the vanishing indigenous people. Sometimes our nation collectively wants to erase those histories. The collective consciousness, the shame. So indifference, I think, is a huge, huge weapon that is often used covertly. And if left untreated, it erases a lot of things. And I think in this case with Sand Creek, because of the fine, dedicated people of the past that made the creation of the national parks, the historic site, possible, hopefully, if in a linear sense, the next generation can have some type of something that they can look forward to. So I'll quit there. Thank you for that question. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fisher, and all of you for your very eloquent and candid responses. I know these are not easy things to discuss, but so important. We do have a question from the audience for Elleni. What were some of your takeaways for making the film?
Well, there were so many things. I mean, the people that I met, I mean, one of the things that I realized was something that Henrietta just touched upon a few minutes ago, was that there are different worldviews and that it's really very different to see the world in a linear fashion versus seeing things in a circular way. And it became really clear to me that the past is always present and that these things, you know, Sand Creek is still here and still impacting today in different ways. And so that really, you know, that was one of the most important things I really learned about in making this film. The other thing is that there's a lot of emotional trauma and pain around this, but at the same time, there's a lot of hope because the tribes resisted and are still here. And I think one of the things we can look at from Sand Creek is that it didn't work. You know, an attempted extermination of First Nations didn't work. People are still here. So that kind of resilience and resistance is also something that I learned about, as you know, Richard Little Bear says in the film, for a lot of white people, you know, Native Americans are in the past, but you know, learning about the resistance that people still have today to this kind of trauma and history is something really important. That was really important for me to learn in making the film.
Thank you very much. We have more questions than we'll probably be able to address this evening, but there are two questions here that are similar regarding intergenerational trauma. One asks, what brings you healing and strength today, and how can non-descendants stand stronger with you in solidarity? The other question is very similar. Intergenerational trauma is real and unimaginable. Instead of all the burden being placed on you as descendants, how can non-descendants best stand with you in solidarity today? I know any one of you could address that question, but shall I send this back over to Dr. Mann first? And
Thank you, Alexa. I was saying she should go to Ryan. He's the one that's talking about historical trauma. But the truth of the matter is, as Elleni had mentioned in the film, It is a part of our ongoing transformation as a people. How can massacres that were as savage at Sand Creek, followed 4 years later by the identical savagery along the Washita, be forgotten? How can they be forgotten? We need to acknowledge our past. We need to realize that those that came here needed to walk a little bit more sacredly on our land and to realize that we are all relative. And instead of putting us as obstacles in the way of manifest destiny that has created these kinds of social conflicts that unfortunately seem to be much more and I don't want to call it inheritance, but the fallout for a lot of our younger people. We need to be as proactive about regenerating this land's first peoples in much the same way that this very country of ours, the United States of America, was so insistent upon doing in terms of the Marshall Plan for the German people. We have never had that kind of direct attention at the kind of issues that resulted from massacres and the savagery of contact. And so that it has unfortunately continued to affect, unfortunately, the children and the grandchildren of those that were at Sand Creek. We can go to the place and we need to all visit that to get a feel for what happened. We need to have films like Elleni has put together to remind us of our true history as a country. We need to be very cognizant just of our health as Americans, First Nations, but we need to be as much aware and as proactive when it comes to the mental health of our children whose experience with historical trauma has certainly come out in terms of addictions with alcohol, with drugs, and the other social ills of this country. So we need to work together. We as Cheyennes and Arapahos certainly could have the kind of support that other nations have gotten to help us to continue to live in a very vibrant way. We are a vibrant people. We have survived. You can just see the evidence in Mr. Fisher and Mr. Ortiz and probably others that are in the audience with us. We don't expect the country to answer all of our problems, but we would certainly appreciate a lot of assistance in terms of the kind of funding that should come to us. We should be among the healthiest people of the world in terms of the amount of land that was taken from us. About 1.5 billion with a B land that was taken from us in treaties. And if treaties are the supreme law of the land, and the federal government said that it was going to provide us with education and with health services, we need to once and for all pay attention to this aspect of historical trauma that was brought about by the military and those who hungered for our land. We are only asking that our treaties be fulfilled in making us hold people with the same respect for life and for other people that all of us should have.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. Ryan, since Dr. Mann mentioned you specifically, would you like to answer the question as well? How can non-descendants stand in solidarity with descendants in the burden of intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, thank you. I spoke to Colorado Department of Medicaid, and that was one of the questions that was asked to them. So I have a little bit of an answer for this and what I think anyway, and the first thing is that non-descendants or non-Indian folks that come into contact, especially school teachers and other folks, need to first understand that there is historical trauma, and that they don't, that a lot of children, young Native American people don't understand what historical trauma is, even now, even today. So they're dealing with their addictions, like Dr. Mann said, or different things that the way that they express this historical trauma, and they don't know that it stems from in a historical event. So the first thing is to help educate them to know that there is historical trauma, what it is, and then be supportive in as like Dr. Mann was saying too, mental health. Mental health is something that needs to be really put in the forefront of people who interact with Native people, because through this historical trauma, as Conrad said, men suppress things because that's what we've been taught, and nowadays it's better to try to talk about those things, but it's hard as a male to do that. So support mental health treatment and stability for people, because it's part of that historical trauma that we deal with, to suppress feelings, to not talk about them, and to really put an emphasis on it's that nowadays it's okay to talk about your feelings. It's okay to talk to somebody in a mental health context, and that it's not shameful, and that's really something that helps with that can a non-descendant or a non-tribal member who deals with specifically children can really put out there and help. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And Conrad, I'd like to give you an opportunity to reply to that as well.
Well, I think it's important that we have some unity when it comes to collective trauma, intergenerational trauma. As natives, we've been, as I mentioned earlier, there's been help from all sides, but again, there's stipulations to that help. So the question that is being asked, I think, is maybe one from a personal view, or is it does it have strings attached to it? Is it an open invitation to assist? I think as tribes, we want to have that help, but at the same time, I think we want to be participants. We want to be able to determine our own destiny on what direction we want to go with the assistance. Those things are important, because for too long, paternalism has been with Native nations. It's always the larger society's view. We know what's good for you. Even today, that we still see that. But in this case, I think with Sand Creek, I think it's important that we all share in this type of healing, and there's different ways of looking at healing strategies, but it has to be something that comes from a Native American perspective. And I really appreciate the question about how can we help with intergenerational trauma. We have a lot of good people out there as well. And maybe these presentations will open up other doors and opportunities and ideas about how to address intergenerational trauma. You know, for too long, we've, as been mentioned earlier, you know, there's always been this attitude about what an indigenous person is, and that's a cultural construct from a larger society that painted this picture of who they thought we are, when in fact I think it's within their own selves that they've painted a dark picture of Native Americans, and we're not that embodiment of what they think we are. But certainly over the years, that has been a picture that has been painted and etched in many different ways about the savage, as we were called at one time, which is really an anti-cultural, anti-civilization concept, because we aren't savages. You know, we're people. We're human beings. We have feelings. You know, we have many different emotions. We have a system in our tribes, a supportive system, if you will. We used to have a supportive system where a child never was fatherless or motherless. They were adopted to extended family relatives, but that has been eroded and diminished by generational trauma, as I mentioned, and it's been those structures that have put us in a place where we have these adverse experiences, and so part of it is the hope of understanding who Native Americans are, and some of the things that we experience as Native Americans, not just in historical events such as these, but within our own past. The you know, presentism isn't the way to go about the historical events that have occurred. I think we all need to have some understanding of each other so that we can move forward. So again, I appreciate the question about standing together in unity, but I hope people understand that we don't want somebody telling us what's good for us at this stage of the game. I think we're past that. We want to determine what direction we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad, and thank you all of you for your very insightful and very candid replies and discussion on these important questions. We have additional questions that I regret we will not have time to get to this evening, as somehow it is already 7:28 and our program was scheduled to go until 7:30. I know we could talk all evening, but I would invite those who asked questions that we were not able to answer tonight. We do have this session recorded. We have your questions, but if you would please email us at the email address that's on our website, we will make every effort to get you responses to your questions, because we appreciate the questions very, very much. We would like to invite everyone to please learn more about the Sand Creek Massacre Foundation. Visit our website, join our email list if you'd like, learn about our partners, including the National Park Service, each one of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. Please visit Elleni Sclavenitis' website, and please visit our YouTube channel as well, where this the recording of this session will be posted. You can find the link to that from our website. And with that, I believe it concludes our evening tonight, but I would really like to thank, more than I can express, each one of our very distinguished and esteemed panelists. Thank you very much to Elleni for contributing your remarkable film. And thank you to Matt LeBlanc, who is behind the scenes doing the engineering for our very first speaker series. We will be continuing our speaker series. Please keep an eye out for announcements about future presentations. And thank you to every single participant who signed on tonight and who registered for this event. We appreciate your participation very much, and please stay tuned for more. And thank you all. I have a, okay. Matt says it's okay to wrap it up. So with that, thank you all very much for attending tonight and for each of you. And we will see you again very soon.